The fire was the first algorithm, a flickering processor of warmth and light that computed the most essential human equation: survival through togetherness. Long before silicon and code, this primal gathering place ran the ancient software of social wiring, a program so deeply embedded in the human psyche that its commands still dictated behavior millennia later. Dr. Eva Rostova imagined the scene with the vivid clarity of a recurring dream. A huddled band of early humans, their faces painted in dancing orange shadows, sharing the heat of the flames and the safety of the collective. An individual alone in the encroaching darkness was a story ending in silence, a set of bones picked clean by predators. But an individual within the circle of firelight was part of a narrative, a thread in a social fabric strong enough to withstand the brutal pressures of an indifferent world. Belonging was not a luxury, it was the fundamental currency of existence. Eva's own sense of belonging had fractured just a week earlier in a brightly lit conference hall that felt colder than any prehistoric night. She had stood at the periphery of a buzzing circle of senior academics, their laughter a solid wall she could not penetrate. The physical distance was mere feet, but the psychological chasm felt unbridgeable. A junior researcher with a radical hypothesis, she was an outlier, her data points challenging the comfortable consensus of the group. The sharp sting of that exclusion had been surprisingly physical, a visceral ache in her chest that her rational mind struggled to explain. Now, back in the quiet sanctuary of her university office, she connected the two scenes, the ancient and the modern, with the threads of neuroscience. Her fingers traced the lines of a brain scan diagram, pinpointing the neural pathways that lit up with social pain. The same regions that registered the distress of physical injury flared when a person felt ostracized. Mirror neurons, those clever little cells, allowed humans to feel each other's joys and failures as if they were their own, creating an invisible, empathetic tether between individuals. This was the biological bedrock of the tribe. To be cast out was not just emotionally painful. It was a primal alarm screaming of imminent danger, a relic of a time when exile was a death sentence. The realization settled over her not as a clinical finding, but as a personal truth. Her drive to understand social wiring was not merely an academic pursuit. It was a map of her own deep-seated need for connection, a need so powerful it could make a room full of people feel like an empty savanna, and a memory of a tribal fire feel like home. The ancient code was not just in the textbooks, it was pulsing quietly within her, a timeless program searching for its tribe. The world was a stage, Eva realized, but the scripts were never handed out. They were absorbed through the skin, whispered on subconscious frequencies, and performed with the unthinking grace of a heartbeat. From the choreographed ballet of a family dinner, where forks were lifted in unison and laughter erupted in polite, predictable waves, to the hushed rituals of the workplace, where the coffee machine became an altar for unspoken hierarchies and deferred ambitions, she saw the patterns everywhere. These were the invisible scripts, the silent conductors of the human orchestra, and their power lay in the fact that no one ever acknowledged they were reading from the same page. To document this phenomenon, she designed a simple experiment, positioning herself as a quiet observer in the sterile waiting room of a busy dental clinic. She watched as the first arrival, a woman in a blue coat, picked up a magazine. The next person to enter, a man with a briefcase, did the same, his movements a near-perfect echo. A third person sat and immediately crossed their legs. Within minutes, two others in the vicinity had adopted the same posture. It was a silent, seamless dance of mimicry, a non-verbal conversation where agreement was communicated through the tilt of a head or the fold of arms. No one was consciously copying anyone, yet a uniform rhythm of behavior emerged, creating a temporary, cohesive tribe bound by the unspoken rule of conformity. This silent compliance brought to mind the stark, elegant cruelty of Solomon Asch's line experiments. Eva pictured the Confederates in that old study, their faces blank, as they unanimously declared the obviously shorter line to be the longer one. The real subject, the lone dissenter in a sea of consensus, would often squirm, their confidence eroding under the weight of collective judgment. Later, in her interviews with participants from a modern replication, she heard the same bewildered confession repeated like a mantra. They had seen the truth clear as day, but the need to belong, to not rock the boat, to avoid the searing isolation of being the odd one out, had been a stronger force than their own perception. 1. Young man shrugged, a flush of shame coloring his cheeks as he admitted to agreeing that a circle was more square than a triangle, simply because everyone else in the room had said so. The tension was palpable in his retelling, the acute discomfort of the individual mind warring with the profound, biological imperative to be part of the group. These invisible scripts dictated everything, from the trivial to the profound. They told people when to laugh, what to buy, who to trust, and what to believe. To step outside the script was to risk becoming a social phantom, visible but disconnected, a lone voice in a chorus that had suddenly fallen silent. Eva understood now that the desire for individuality was often a luxury, a fragile construct that could collapse under the primal, overwhelming need to simply belong. The fire of the ancient tribe still burned, and its light cast long, compelling shadows that shaped every step, every gesture, and every whispered agreement in the modern world. Eva had always considered her identity a solid, self-authored thing, a sculpture carved from personal convictions and hard-won knowledge. But her new research revealed it to be something far more fluid, a mask donned and adjusted for each new tribe she entered. To understand how groups sculpted the self, she immersed herself in two new worlds: a fervent online book club debating dystopian fiction and a local community group organizing a neighborhood garden. In both, she felt the subtle, powerful pull of in-group bias, the gravitational force that warps perception to favor one's own team. The book club's debate over a controversial novel's climax became a virtual battlefield. Eva watched, fascinated, as members she knew to be thoughtful and nuanced in private messages transformed into staunch, simplistic defenders of their chosen interpretation. They were no longer discussing a book, they were defending a flag. When she tentatively offered a middle ground perspective, she was met with a wall of polite but firm resistance from both sides. Her comment was not evaluated on its merit, but on its allegiance. She felt a surprising urge to double down, to sharpen her own arguments into weapons for a side she hadn't even known she was on an hour before. The thrill of belonging to a faction, of having allies in a war of words, was a potent, seductive force. This external experiment in tribalism mirrored a deeper, more personal conflict simmering within her. Her identity as a scientist, built on a foundation of skepticism and empirical evidence, was a suit of armor she wore into the world. But it clashed painfully with the warm, unquestioning traditions of her family. At a recent Sunday dinner, her aunt had pressed a family heirloom, a small, smooth stone said to bring luck, into her hand. The rational part of Eva's mind dismissed it as a placebo, a piece of inert geology. Yet she found herself pocketing it, feeling its weight. To reject it was to reject a piece of her family's identity, and by extension, a piece of her own. The mask of the scientist felt rigid and cold in the face of her family's soft, enduring faith in stories and symbols. Seeking clarity, she interviewed a sociologist who spoke of social identity theory, the idea that a person's sense of self is derived largely from their group memberships. The academic explained that humans, in a relentless pursuit of self-esteem, perpetually categorize themselves and others. We are not just individuals, we are us. And us is always, in some subtle way, better than them. Eva thought of the book club, her family, her academic colleagues. In each arena, she was playing a part, emphasizing certain traits and suppressing others to maintain her membership card. The stone in her pocket wasn't just a rock. It was a token of her belonging to the Rostova tribe. Her carefully constructed arguments in the book club were her dues paid to the tribe of intellectual debate. The realization was both unsettling and liberating. Identity was not a singular, true self waiting to be discovered. It was a collection of masks, each one granting access to a different fire, a different circle of warmth and safety. The mask was not a lie, it was a passport. It was the price of admission to the tribe, a performance required to keep the ancient, terrifying darkness of solitude at bay. Her true self, she began to suspect, was not the face beneath the masks, but the quiet, observant consciousness that chose which one to wear. The sterile white room hummed with a quiet, mechanical menace. Dr. Eva Rostova sat before a console labeled with escalating voltage levels, her palms slick against the cool plastic of the toggle switch. Across a pane of reinforced glass, a volunteer, a kindly-looking man in his 50s, was strapped into a chair, electrodes snaking from his temples to a formidable-looking machine. The researcher in the crisp lab coat stood behind Eva, his voice a calm, unwavering monotone that brooked no argument. This was a modern, ethically sanitized replication of Milgram's obedience experiment, but the psychological architecture felt terrifyingly authentic. The script was simple. She was to administer a learning test, and for every wrong answer, she was to deliver a shock, increasing the voltage with each error. The first wrong answer came, and Eva's finger hesitated for a fraction of a second before she flipped the switch. A mild buzz sounded in the adjacent room. The volunteer flinched, a brief, performative wince. It was harmless, she reminded herself. The shocks were a theatrical fiction, the volunteer's reactions a carefully rehearsed performance. Yet with each subsequent error, the voltage dial climbed higher on the console. 75 volts, 120, 150. The man's protests grew more earnest, his pleas tinged with genuine-sounding anxiety. He complained of a heart condition. Sweat beaded on Eva's upper lip, her own heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her rational mind screamed that this was a simulation, that no real harm was being done, but a deeper, more primal part of her was screaming louder. The authority figure in the lab coat was a pillar of certainty in the room. His repeated, placid instruction, "The experiment requires that you continue," became a hypnotic mantra, overriding her own moral compass. Her finger moved almost of its own volition, a marionette's limb pulled by the strings of commanded obedience. She pushed the switch for 195 volts, then 240. The man in the other room cried out, then fell silent, a terrifying stillness that was worse than any shout. A cold nausea washed over her. She was a scientist, a thinker, a person who prided herself on ethical rigor, and yet here she was, systematically torturing a stranger because a man in a white coat had told her it was necessary. The switch in her hand was not just a piece of plastic. It was a conduit for a terrifying psychological transfer, a device that offloaded the burden of responsibility onto the shoulders of authority. When the researcher finally called a halt to the procedure, Eva's hand was trembling, her body slick with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The ethical implications of what she had almost done, of what thousands had done in the original studies, settled in her gut like a shard of ice. That evening, seeking a distraction, she scrolled through her social media feeds, only to find herself witnessing another, far more virulent experiment in obedience unfolding in real time. A minor celebrity had made an off-color joke, and the digital mob was assembling with breathtaking speed. The authority here was not a single man in a lab coat, but the faceless, roaring consensus of the crowd. Thousands of avatars, individuals who would likely be polite in person, were now firing off waves of vitriolic comments, death wishes, and calls for professional ruin. They were administering their own form of shock therapy, each keystroke a jolt of social voltage, and they did so with the serene confidence of those whose responsibility was perfectly diffused among the multitude. No single person was orchestrating the pylon. It was an emergent phenomenon, a hive mind unleashed. Eva watched the carnage, her stomach churning with a fresh wave of recognition. This was the obedience switch weaponized on a global scale. The authority of the mob, the diffusion of responsibility across thousands of anonymous profiles, created a perfect storm where morality was effortlessly overridden by the primal urge to belong to the punishing tribe, to be on the right side of the digital fire. The social instincts that had once ensured survival by promoting group cohesion were now being hijacked, turned into a cudgel to enforce conformity and destroy dissent. The switch was not just in a lab. It was in everyone's pocket, waiting for the right command, the right target, the right excuse to flip and override the conscience of the individual in service to the will of the tribe. The code had evolved. It no longer whispered around the flickering light of a fire, but pulsed through fiber optic cables, a silent, omnipresent current shaping a new kind of tribalism. Doctor Eva Rostova sat before a bank of monitors, her face illuminated by the cold, blue glow of data visualizations that mapped the human soul in ones and zeros. She was tracking the social media algorithms, the invisible architects of the modern agora. On one screen, a cascade of political opinions formed two distinct, swirling vortexes of red and blue, their edges sharpening, their centers deepening into impenetrable cores. These were digital echo chambers, vast, self-reinforcing cathedrals of consensus, where every shared article was a hymn and every dissenting voice was a blasphemy to be silenced. The algorithms, optimized for engagement above all else, were master cartographers, tirelessly redrawing the tribal boundaries, not with stones and territory, but with confirmation, bias, and outrage. Her research was supposed to be observational, a detached analysis from the high ground of academia, but the pull of the digital current was stronger than she had anticipated. A stray comment she made on a post about her book club's debated novel was misconstrued, sparking a thread of aggressive replies. A notification chimed, a like, then another, a retweet from someone with a large following. A small, unexpected flare of pleasure warmed her chest. She typed a rebuttal, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a speed that felt less like thought and more like reflex. Another chime, a cascade of notifications now, a digital applause that was as potent as any physical reward. She was in the arena, her heart beating a little faster, her focus narrowing to the tiny screen in her hand. The dopamine rush was a tangible force, a chemical reward for tribal loyalty, for a well-aimed barb in a war of words she hadn't meant to start. For 20 minutes, she was not a scientist studying the phenomenon. She was a subject living it, hooked on the industrial-grade social validation the platform provided. Shaken by her own susceptibility, she sought the clarity of expert voices. She interviewed a former platform engineer, a weary-eyed man who spoke of variable reward schedules and social validation feedback loops with the grim tone of a repentant weapons designer. He described how every like, every share, was a carefully calibrated pellet of reinforcement, training the user to seek the approval of their digital tribe with the same primal urgency as their ancestors sought the approval of the hunter's circle. Another expert, a neuroscientist, showed her brain scans of subjects using social media. The patterns of activation were identical to those seen in individuals gambling or using certain drugs. The reward centers lit up in a brilliant, addictive fireworks display. The platforms, she realized, hadn't invented social bonding. They had industrialized it, weaponized it, and scaled it to a level the human brain was never designed to handle. Walking home through the city that evening, Eva watched the glow of smartphone screens on the faces in the crowd, a constellation of isolated tribes. The question that had been simmering within her since the Twitter argument finally surfaced with crystalline clarity. Was this technology the ultimate liberation of the social mind, a tool that connected humanity across vast distances, allowing for the formation of communities based on interest and ideology rather than mere geography? Or was it the most sophisticated trap ever devised, an architecture that exploited ancient social wiring to keep users perpetually engaged, polarized, and profitably addicted? The fire of the ancient tribe now burned on 1 billion individual screens, offering the illusion of connection while often deepening the chasms of understanding. It promised a global village, but delivered a planet of warring digital clans, each huddled around its own flickering, algorithmic flame, believing its light to be the only one that mattered. The technology that promised to set the social mind free had, she feared, built it a prison of endless, rewarding echoes. The polished surface of the seminar table reflected the sterile glow of the projection screen, creating a distorted mirror of the assembled faces. Dr. Eva Rostova stood before her peers, her data on cognitive dissonance laid bare in clean, elegant charts. She presented her findings with the careful cadence of a scientist, detailing how individuals, when confronted with information that clashed with their group's beliefs, would often twist logic into pretzels to preserve their sense of belonging. The evidence was robust, gathered from surveys, controlled experiments, and even her own forays into digital and real-world tribes. She expected debate, perhaps some pointed questions about methodology. What she received was a wall of veiled hostility, a quiet storm of skepticism that felt less like scientific rigor and more like a defense of sacred ground. A senior professor from the sociology department, a man whose work was foundational to the field, leaned forward, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. He did not attack her data points, but her framing, her interpretation. He spoke of contextual nuance and overstated conclusions, his words a soft but persistent erosion of her thesis. Another colleague, a woman Eva had once considered a friendly acquaintance, cited a handful of obscure, contradictory studies, her tone implying that Eva's oversight of them was a fatal flaw. The room's atmosphere grew thick with unspoken allegiances. These were not just individual academics challenging her work. They were representatives of intellectual tribes, their identities and professional standing intertwined with paradigms that her research gently undermined. To accept her conclusions would be to admit a crack in their own worldview, a threat to the cohesion of their academic clan. The truth, it seemed, was less important than the preservation of the tribe's narrative. Later, back in the hollow quiet of her office, the criticism echoed. A seed of doubt, small and insidious, had been planted. What if they were right? What if her desire to prove her theory had blinded her to its weaknesses? She pulled up a recent, highly critical paper one of them had mentioned, its abstract a series of sharp, dismissive jabs. As she read, her mind performed a subtle, almost imperceptible sleight of hand. She found herself latching onto its minor grammatical errors, the arrogant tone of its author, the funding source she considered dubious. She scrutinized these peripheral issues with a fierce, disproportionate intensity, using them as a shield to deflect the paper's core arguments. A cold realization washed over her. She was not evaluating the evidence. She was performing motivated reasoning, actively seeking reasons to dismiss a threat to her own professional identity as a competent, groundbreaking researcher. The very cognitive dissonance she had just presented was now coursing through her own veins. The paradox was suddenly, painfully clear. The human mind, for all its magnificent processing power, was not a pristine logic engine. It was a deeply social organ, and its primary directive was not truth, but belonging. When facts threatened a person's place in their essential tribe, be it family, profession, or political party, the mind would readily abandon logic in a desperate, unconscious act of self-preservation. It would dismiss, distort, or deny, not out of stupidity, but out of a primal fear of exile. She finally understood the infamous backfire effect, the perplexing phenomenon where presenting someone with contradictory evidence could actually strengthen their original belief. It wasn't a failure of intellect, it was a triumph of tribalism. The brain, faced with a choice between being right and being included, would choose inclusion almost every time. The warmth of the fire, whether it flickered in a prehistoric cave, a university department, or a digital feed, was a more compelling master than the cold, lonely light of an inconvenient truth. The paradox was not a cage, but a key. Understanding the mind's inherent bias toward belonging did not have to be a sentence to a life of intellectual conformity. It could be the first, crucial step toward genuine freedom. In the quiet aftermath of the seminar's polite hostility, Dr. Eva Rostova began to forge her own tools for liberation. She started a new notebook, its pages blank slates for a new methodology. The first tool was the deliberate, uncomfortable seeking of diverse perspectives. She forced herself to read the work of her most ardent critics not as an adversary looking for flaws, but as a student searching for nuance. She subscribed to newsletters from across the political spectrum, not to confirm her biases, but to intentionally dislodge them. It was a mental workout, a conscious straining against the gravity of her own echo chamber. The second tool was the practice of intellectual humility, a quiet acknowledgement that her own certainty was often the enemy of understanding. She wrote the words, "I might be wrong," on a sticky note, and affixed it to the corner of her monitor, a small, daily mantra against the arrogance of tribal conviction. This was not about surrendering her core beliefs, but about holding them more lightly, treating them as working hypotheses rather than articles of faith. It was about creating a small pocket of mental space, a buffer zone between a challenging idea and the reflexive need to defend her tribe's position. These were not grand, dramatic gestures, but small, practical disciplines for the mind, a form of cognitive hygiene to counteract the grime of groupthink. Armed with these nascent tools, she faced the most significant decision of her professional life. The book. Her publisher wanted a palatable, consensus-friendly text that would ruffle few feathers and secure her place within the academic establishment. But Eva knew that would be a betrayal of her own research, a performative act of belonging that would negate everything she had learned. Sitting at her desk, the city lights twinkling like a field of distant stars beyond her window, she made her choice. She would write the book honestly. She would detail the uncomfortable truths about obedience, tribalism, and the weaponization of social instincts, even at the risk of professional backlash and exile from the very tribes that had defined her career. The potential for isolation was a cold dread in her stomach, but the prospect of a life lived inside a carefully constructed lie felt infinitely colder. This newfound resolve did not remain confined to her professional life. It seeped into her personal world, bringing to mind a fractured friendship she had long avoided mending. Anya, a friend from graduate school, had been estranged for years after a bitter disagreement over a collaborative project. Their falling out had been a classic case of clashing professional identities, each too proud and too entrenched in their own tribe of one to bridge the gap. Applying her insights, Eva saw the script they had been following, the script of stubbornness, of being right at all costs. She picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over Anya's name. The old social wiring screamed to let it be, to avoid the potential rejection. But her new tools whispered a different command: seek perspective, practice humility. She sent a simple, careful message, acknowledging the complexity of their past conflict without assigning blame and expressing a genuine desire to reconnect. The reply was not immediate, and the waiting was its own form of agony. But when it came, it was not the defensive, tribal retort she had feared. It was cautious, but open. They agreed to meet for coffee, and the conversation that followed was not a rehashing of old battles, but a tentative, mutual exploration of the invisible scripts that had driven them apart. They were not rebuilding a bridge. They were learning a new language, one that made room for the possibility that both of them had been both right and wrong. Walking home, Eva felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The cool evening air was not a threat, but an invitation. She understood now that the goal was not to escape social wiring entirely. That was an impossible, lonely fantasy. The human heart would always yearn for the fire. The escape was from unconscious obedience to those instincts,